The West has been facing a worker shortage far longer than most would like to admit. But how far back does that problem really go? And how have we tried to solve it? Who deserves housing in exchange for labor? And when does labor become something more like force? These are the questions our guest is bringing to light in today's episode of The Stories Your City Forgot. With that in mind, let's let him introduce himself.
Oh yeah, well, thanks for inviting me. I'm an old goat. I didn't tell you how old I was, but I taught history for 40 years. I'm a Boise State graduate with a master's degree there, and taught there for 20 years. I have a PhD from University of Washington. I had a teaching fellowship there. I was thinking of the port of Seattle. I had an internship at the port as with the tariff business going on, and back then the big issue was the ports were leaders in arguing for normalizing trade with China because we didn't have trade with communist China. And old Richard Nixon, that was one of his accomplishments amidst his many failures. And of course, that was a bonanza for trade, Pacific trade. And I wrote a history, the 75th anniversary of the Port of Seattle, there with a colleague,
Wow.
Lynn Getz, and it was a terrific experience. But I 20 years ago, 25 years ago, took a job here at CSI to teach Latin American history. My PhD's in Latin American history, although after I finished my graduate work, I returned to Boise State where I'd been teaching and was there as a student and served as the director of Canadian Studies. I had a area of specialization in Canadian studies. So I've enjoyed the conversations recently about Canada, and reminds me of my task as the director of Canadian Studies was to educate people in the United States about Canada because Canada's second largest country in the world and people don't know anything about it. And the Canadians started programs around the country, around the United States in colleges, Canadian Studies program. And Boise State had a very fine one there. And so I had a stint as Canadian Studies, but the last 25 years I've been here at CSI teaching and doing various history projects in the community. As you know, we have a nonprofit here, Preservation Twin Falls. I've retired, and in my retirement, I'm president of Preservation Twin Falls and doing all kinds of history projects.
Yeah, and
That's, that's what leads us to the conversation today. My history project with the labor camp here is
yeah.
a Preservation Twin Falls project.
Yeah, so kind of fun how these kind of things always kind of come in circles a little bit, isn't it? So tell me a little bit about when you first learned about the El Milagro workers camp.
Well, I'm a native from southern Idaho, so I know about the labor camps that are a part of southern Idaho. There's a couple dozen, and I'm from what's called the Mini-Cassia area. That's the Burley, Rupert, and Paul. And in Paul, a big amalgamated sugar plant, and there was a labor camp there, and a labor camp in Rupert, and a labor camp in Hayburn, and a labor camp in Burley. These were temporary labor camps. As you know, when I came to CSI, I worked for a long time on the internment camp, the Minidoka Relocation Center. And 10,000 people lived out there. It was the seventh largest city in Idaho during the Second World War. And so as a result of my work with Minidoka, I learned about Japanese Americans getting out of the concentration camp and going to work on farms. And many of them got out to go live at the Twin Falls Area Labor Camp, which was started in 1939 as a Farm Security Administration camp. Now, when the Farm Security Administration was created in the New Deal as a part of those alphabet agencies,
Right.
it was set up to help poor white folks from the South in the Dust Bowl that migrated west and to provide housing. And then, of course, here in Idaho, we needed farm workers. And so it was built in 1939. There were two of them in Idaho, one in Caldwell and one here in Twin Falls. And so it's a very interesting story. And I knew about it but not too much about it. And then, as you know, here at CSI, we had a huge influx of Hispanic students, and for some years aspired to be a Hispanic serving institution, which we became. And of course, we no longer are able to talk about that because of the nature of the world, the end of diversity and all. But during my time teaching at CSI, I was involved in some research related to El Milagro and learned a little bit about it. So I knew about it, but then a couple of years ago with Preservation Twin Falls, it became an issue because it was being torn down and turned into some sort of low-income housing units. And so what we do at Preservation Twin Falls is look at historic places and try to preserve them or be involved. And I became involved with the Farm Security Administration Preservation Project. And I have a little document here that's put out by the Community Council of Idaho. I'll just show it here. The FSA Preservation Project. And as they tore down all of the buildings there, and there were 65 casitas, they were called garden houses, because the labor camps were set up for just the harvest season in about April to November. But these places were set up for these white migrants to be kind of permanent and help farmers get reestablished on the land. And so the two FSA camps, one in Caldwell, one here, had barracks that were seasonal and very much like what was out at Minidoka and the other concentration camps, because the FSA built these camps, and then the FSA became central player in the relocation of 100,000 Japanese Americans. And so it's very interesting that they needed. Minidoka was for 10,000. El Milagro housed 1,000 people, but it was made for one reason, and then the war started. And during the war, Japanese Americans left Minidoka, Hunt we call it here, and were able to go out and live at the labor camp. And many of them went over to Paul and lived in the labor camp. And actually, Japanese Americans were brought up from Manzanar here because the demand for agriculture and agriculture workers, went through the roof. People who had a chance to leave farm work did, and they went to the coast maybe and got nice jobs in factories. And so there was a tremendous demand for workers, and Japanese filled that void. Of course, Mexican Americans, and then in 1942 we entered into the bracero program. That was to get Mexican nationals and bring them to Southern California, Texas, and here to Idaho. And so that camp there went from being a place for poor folks fleeing the Dust Bowl to serving Mexican Americans, Mexican nationals, Japanese Americans, prisoners of war. And they brought in a group of Jamaicans as a part of a deal with the British. And 50 Jamaicans during the Second World War went out and lived there at the labor camp. And so if you can imagine the nature of Southern Idaho population, and out there was a cultural mix that it's hard to imagine. Of course, grade school kids, high school kids were taken out of school. That's when the idea of harvest vacation started. There was tremendous demand for farm workers and for farm products. And so all hands on deck. Now very quickly, the whole thing changed again when the war was over, because the Japanese Americans go, of course, many stay here in the Magic Valley, but they're no longer, a few do stay and live at the labor camp in the permanent houses. But the Jamaicans are gone, the prisoners of war are gone. And so what is left are Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals. And I have a pile of books here in the library about the Bracero program. My colleague at the University of Washington is the leading scholar on the matter, Erasmo Gamboa, and he wrote the story of the Braceros in the Pacific Northwest. There were 5 of these FSA camps. And And of course, the treatment of the Mexican nationals is legendary here because of the mistreatment, the racism. The braceros made a contract, the contracts were violated. What farmers had to do is provide transportation, housing, and agree to a certain wage. So in 1945, the Mexican government sort of cut off braceros to Idaho. It was considered the worst in the Pacific Northwest, and therefore the worst in the Western United States for treatment. And the bracero program ended in the Pacific Northwest in 1947. Now, it went on for the rest of the country until 1962. A worker contract system, bringing Mexicans from Mexico to work on contract, and then they'd go back maybe. And of course, that back and forth of Latin workers in the Western United States in Idaho is a part of our history for 100 years. So after the war, the government got out of the FSA shut down, and local farmers took over control of the labor camp. And that's a long, complicated story that transitioned from the government managing it during the war and a vital part of the war effort to now we need the farm labor resources, but the government wants to get out of it. I saw a newspaper article where the city actually put in a bid to buy it, the county, and a farmers organization, 600 farmers, ended up buying or having the facility given to them. That's a bunch of barracks, community center house, 65 garden houses. I mean, a facility for 1,000 people. And so they took it over in 1947, and Amalgamated Sugar was involved, and the local farmers, and then they managed it from that time until the 1970s, 1980s. At that point, migrant labor had changed. The number of people living out there had diminished. The facility had fallen in great disrepair. And 50 years ago, this summer, Justin, there was a labor protest as people living there marched from El Milagro, that's 2 miles south of town, to Twin Falls City Park to protest living conditions and sanitary conditions. The book I'm writing on this, I tell a story about the manager out there who wore a badge and had a gun and was kicking people out of their places, and it looked like giving preference to white folks for the permanent houses and kicking Hispanic people out of there. It was a very tense situation where lots of poor people lived. And of course, the police and sheriffs were constantly involved in going out there. So the Idaho Migrant Council took it over, and the Idaho Migrant Council became the Community Council of Idaho. And the Community Council of Idaho is in the process of saving, and again, I'll show you one other picture here. These two buildings, and that's called a dormitory, a bathhouse, comfort center, because the barracks didn't have, running water, and so there's like a community bathhouse. And then the building below is the barracks, and that barracks, you can see the doors, is divided into 6 apartments.
Yeah.
And so we put a new roof on there. We have new stovepipes. We're going to divide this barracks into 3 sections. One's going to be like a barracks like it was in the 1940s and 50s. And then one's going to be a kind of a learning center, like a museum, a library. And then the other part is going to be a research center. Those are the plans to create a monument, like a historic site that will tell the story of the labor camp and of migrant workers in Idaho. That's the whole story in a nutshell, Justin.
Yeah, you've got a fascinating building here. Can we talk a little bit about what was the treatment in this El Milagro workers camp, and how did it differ from the concentration camp of the Minidoka region. And what do you think is the big defining distinction between the two?
Well, so the Japanese American camp was built in the summer, at Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066 in February 19th, 1942. And then people moved in there in the end of the summer, August, September. And during that time, between Executive Order 9066 and when they moved to the camps that were built, Japanese Americans lived in these centers along the coast in Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and old fairgrounds and racetracks, and then they came to these different concentration camps, and they were barbed wire, and they were under guard, and now they could get out. Japanese Americans could get out and go to work. And I mentioned getting out and going to El Milagro. And in the book that I wrote about that, a book called Surviving Minidoka, I tell the story of a famous woodworker, George Nakashima, who went back and forth with a group of Japanese Americans every day to work on a farm, Mr. Vaughn's farm, raising carrots. And after 2 or 3 days, Mr. Vaughn asked the people at Hunt if it was okay if these kids drove themselves back and forth in the pickup, and that's what they did. They'd go out to the farm and come back and check themselves into, what living conditions there for the people that came from Seattle, Portland, in the desert of Jerome. And of course, the kids, it was a different thing for the kids. But imagine being middle-aged with a couple kids or an older person. It was a nightmare. Now you could get out, not just go to the farms. You could get out, and George Nakashima got out to go to Philadelphia to live in Buck County, Pennsylvania, where he started his famous woodworking shop there. And so you just couldn't go back into the 500-mile military zone along the West Coast. You couldn't go back home. That's a very unique and dramatic story in American history, putting 100,000 American citizens in concentration camps. And then when they left, the going home is a story about what they lost, and of course, still pretty intense racism against Japanese Americans. Becomes part of the civil rights movement, and the kids, history didn't record this story. We didn't talk about it. The people that went there didn't talk about it. The kids learned about it when they grew up and went to college and found out that grandma and grandpa had been treated this way and this really horrific event. Now, the Mexican-American story is a different one. I tell people, the Mexicans were here a long time before the Caucasians. The Spanish had the control of the Americas to begin with, and Spanish America extended all the way, to the Idaho-Nevada border. And then Mexican Americans and Japanese were very much a part of Idaho history as well, in terms of coming in and working on farms and railroads long before Pearl Harbor. But the Mexicans, Latin Americans were a part of Western history in mining, in building railroads, in agriculture from day one. And then I think the other thing is, but they came voluntarily. The Japanese Americans were forced. Now, again, a lot of Japanese Americans came to Southern Idaho. They weren't forced. They came here to get jobs and hopefully get land. But what happened was the state in California, the Western states passed laws that prohibited them from owning land. The very interesting sort of comparison, but really the large numbers of Mexican Americans working in this back and forth from Texas, Southern California, making their way up to Idaho in April and May, and sort of going hither and yonder, working in picking peas in eastern Idaho. One of the camps is over in Wilder, where they had hops farms, and of course around here it was the stoop labor of sugar beets, which is very intensive, labor intensive and tough work. Potatoes. Now in the 60s and 70s, potato beets became mechanized and the demand for migrant worker. And so, of course, what happened over the generations is that Hispanic people came, Hispanic people left, back and forth, and then stayed and become like the largest minority in the state of Idaho that's been a very significant contributor to our economic development, doing, this stoop labor, the tough work, uh, that Caucasians don't want to do. And so Gamboa sort of argues in his book, it's the fact that the sort of Latin labor came in to take this work that nobody else wanted to do, allowed Caucasian workers to move on to better, um, uh, higher paying, more status kind of jobs. And so, critical part of the ag economy, and then the kind of racism, and I won't go on to the long diatribe about the history of racism towards Asians, but of course the immigration was cut off. The Exclusionary Act of 1882, the Gentleman's Agreement with Teddy Roosevelt, essentially shut off Japanese uh, uh, migration. And so what that did is to make the Hispanic labor even more important, because Asian labor immigration was shut down. And so, in terms of Mexico, I mean, I guess if you study history, it's not that complicated. The Tejanos rebelled, as you know, and remember the Alamo. And George Polk annexed Texas. The concern at the time before the Civil War would be a slave state and this balance of slave and free states. And when he annexed Texas, then that precipitated the Mexican-American War. Andrew Jackson and James Polk both tried to make a real estate deal and purchase uh, part of Mexico, and the Mexican government uh, wouldn't sell. Sort of like the Canadian Prime Minister the other day, it's not for sale.
Right.
And so James Polk precipitated the war that resulted in Mexico losing half of its territory. And then in 1910, Mexico has the Mexican Revolution, a 10-year civil war on the border. And so there's this intense kind of racism and hostility towards Mexicans. And then in the 20th century, white workers blame their problems. And when the economy goes bad, the cheap labor gets accused of causing the problems. So in the 20s and 30s, Mexicans were deported after their contributions to the war and the war effort. And then, as I explained earlier, during the Second World War, the Bracero program. And then after the Second World War, Eisenhower instituted that famous wetback, Operation Wetback, which was deporting. I have a pile of books here, Justin, the deportation machine and the story of the birth of the border. There was no border patrol. And it's once we set up the quota on immigration in the 1920s, you start regulating the border. And so that Mexican U.S. border, as they say in Mexico, pobre Mexico, so close to the United States, so far from God. And so the relationship between the United States and Mexico is just fundamentally different from sort of U.S.-Asian relations. I mean, the Mexicans are Americans.
That's
the interesting dynamic.
Yeah, that it's interesting how all that kind of contextualized information really is kind of on display at this labor camp in southern Idaho. Dr. Tremayne, we're running out of time here today. Uh, I feel like
Sorry, I'm so long-winded.
no, you did. We're doing great. If somebody liked what they were hearing from you talk about today, where can they get more information about you? Any plugs on where they can find your research or what you're working on?
Well, it's a work in progress, but you can, of course, get me to feel free to contact me there at my email, rtremaine.csi.edu, and Justin knows how to get hold of me. I'm president of Preservation Twin Falls. We have a nonprofit. We have a web page. You can look us up at preservationtwinfalls.com, and there's kind of what we're doing now. We're doing a lot of things The El Milagro project is a project that I'm working on. They hired me professionally to consult on the business, and so Preservation Twin Falls has a lots of things going on that are not related to El Milagro. But I'm hoping to, if you, I'm hoping to produce some material here as a part of my work there, and that's part of the gig. There really isn't a book about this. There is on the Caldwell camp, has been studied, and quite a bit of material. That's what inspired me here. This is a really important story for Southern Idaho. If you're in agriculture, you use that camp labor, and it's one of these stories that's shoved under the covers. So I'm happy to share. Call me. I'll get my Zoom fixed up properly, and I'd be happy to talk on the phone, on email, through Preservation Twin Falls, or through rtremayne.csi.edu. But I'm always eager to talk about history, and this is a subject that I have great passion for, and I'll be working on for a couple of years. So hopefully I'll have a book on it before I get to my grave.
Every historian looks to write a book at some point, right?
Well, I know, but I've got a couple books out, and so I'm good with that. But I would like to do a book on this because I think it's important. And but there is the joke when you're a retired historian or a retired professor, what are you doing? It's like, well, I'm working on a book. Now I'm not getting very far very fast. I'm playing more than I'm working, but I'm still working on a book, and I get it done someday.
Right on.
I don't have a deadline, buddy.
You're so right. When there's no deadline, you can take it at your own pace.
And that's fantasy, because there is a deadline. This project's a 3-year project. We got a nice Mellon Foundation grant to support this project, and so Donald Trump, I don't think, can pull the budget on us with the federal grant. It was a federal facility originally, and obviously it's about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, but when people talk to me about that, I'm like, I know nothing about that. This is about history, and I'm a historian. I've been a historian for almost 50 years, and I know what's important history. And I have some of my colleagues around town. People aren't interested in the old labor camp, and the fact that I'm passionate about it. I says, well, no one was interested in Hunt. No one was interested in Minidoka 30 years ago. And now, as you well know, it's like the biggest deal around town with the historic site there and the national park. But it's a big deal, and I think maybe what we'll do here is save the history, and maybe someday there'll be a little more appreciation. It's the 85th anniversary of the building of the FSA camp.
Wow, it's coming on up.
And it's all gone. It's all torn down. Now, I watched it torn down over the last year and a half, and the only things left is that barracks, the bathroom, and I have one casita, and they'll be put together. And so those of you that are interested, contact me. I hope someday we can go walk and do a little walking tour and see the site, and we can get a vision of what was there, a huge campus, and get a little better feel. Don't read history. Go out and get blisters, not hemorrhoids.
There you go. I like that. That's a perfect way to cap this off. Dr. Tremayne, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, my friend. Sorry.
Oh, no.
Let's do it again.
Yeah, we'll have you on again at some point. Thanks, Doctor. I really appreciate it.
Take care. Have a good day.
El Milagro isn't a one-off. There were camps like it across the West, as Dr. Tremayne explained, but nearly all of them have faded from memory. I want to personally thank Dr. Tremayne for bringing this story to us, because without his work, this piece of history might have been lost forever. This was a story your city forgot. Until now, have a nice night.